Hello, and welcome back to my series of short introductions to my social stratification seminar. Well, spring really is here now, and I've responded to that by shaving off my beard. But you probably don't want to know about my personal grooming habits, so let's get on with what we're supposed to be talking about. So, this week we're back to origins and destinations, but with a slightly different point of view. People start off and end up in different places. There are unequal social origins and unequal social destinations. We're trying to understand how the origin distribution turns into the destination distribution. So, what are the mechanisms and pathways, and how does inequality evolve over the life course? In 2003, Leon Feinstein published an article in the economics journal Economica. It was unusual in at least one respect, in that it contained almost no economic reasoning whatsoever. It did, however, report some interesting empirical results about the evolution of cognitive ability over childhood. This is an important topic because, rather obviously, cognitive ability is a predictor of success in school, and success in school is a predictor of adult socioeconomic success. These results were potentially important, for they appeared to show something that nobody had noticed before. Comparing children of high and low ability from high and low SES backgrounds, Feinstein appeared to show that high ability kids from low SES backgrounds performed increasingly less well as they aged, whereas low ability kids from high SES backgrounds appeared to perform increasingly better. The turnaround was so great that over time the relative positions of the two groups was reversed. This really caught the zeitgeist and fitted the Britain has a social mobility problem narrative just like a glove. However, there was just one problem. The surprising result was probably an artifact of the way the data were analysed, rather than a fact about reality. This possibility, I must say, did strike me at the time. But the case is most convincingly made by John Jerrim and Anna Vignoles in a subsequent article. The problem is what is known as regression to the mean. All tests, including tests of cognitive ability, measure whatever it is that they measure with less than 100% accuracy. There is always measurement error. Kids that do well or poorly at the first application of a test will likely do worse or better at the second application, because whatever lucky or unlucky breaks they got when taking the first test will not, on average, be repeated at subsequent tests. This means that those with very high and low scores, when measured for a second time, will tend to have scores closer to the mean. The genesis of the Feinstein pattern is a little more complicated than this, but essentially this is the kind of process that's likely to be generating the empirical pattern he observed. If anyone is interested, you can go to my home page. I'll put a link in the description of the video, and you'll find there some stator code that simulates what is going on. Why does any of this matter? Well, the message that was frequently taken away from Feinstein's work was that there was something going on in the school system that made smart kids from poor backgrounds dumber and dumb kids from privileged backgrounds smarter. If that were true, it would be quite a thing, and sociologists would be in work for quite a while trying to uncover the mechanisms. However, it is unlikely that it's true. Instead, it's far more likely that smart kids and kids from better off backgrounds do well at cognitive ability tests, and not so smart kids and kids from disadvantaged backgrounds do less well. But this, being the common sense story, wouldn't get much traction in the journals. Dog bites man doesn't make the first edition. Man bites dog is, of course, a front page headline. people spend a long time in education, in some sense what happens there must be important, or we wouldn't devote so much of society's resources into doing it. But it's also true that what comes out of education depends very much on what goes into it. A long time ago, a book was written called 15,000 Hours, which at the time was roughly how many hours the average child spent in school. The book attempted to pin down what it is about schools that makes some successful and others failures. It didn't take long for a wit to write a critique asking, well, what about the 70,000 hours that the child spends outside of school? Maybe, just maybe, that is the difference. The characteristics of the pupils, what sort of homes they come from, and how much talent they have, are not irrelevant in determining what comes out of the school system. But does education modify the input? This seems to be an important question to get to grips with in the light of claims that all that really matters is the cognitive talent that goes into one end of the educational sausage machine. This, in essence, is the claim of one of the social science bestsellers of the 1990s, Herrnstein and Murray's The Bell Curve. This book opened up a whole can of worms, which I've no time to consider right now. However, one issue that is central to their argument is worth spending a little time on. That is the extent to which cognitive ability influences the amount of schooling a child receives, and reciprocally, the extent to which schooling influences cognitive ability. The way Herrnstein and Murray tell it, the process is almost entirely one way. Smart kids get a lot of schooling, and those with a lot of schooling do well later on in the labour market. That allows them to argue that the source of later inequality is unequal cognitive ability, and that leads almost seamlessly to them seeking for ultimate causes in whatever it is that makes cognitive ability unequal. Needless to say, schooling itself does not feature high in their list of candidates. However, Winship and Korneman take the reciprocal relationship seriously and try to estimate the magnitudes involved. It turns out that there is a reciprocal relationship. Being smart leads to you getting more schooling, but getting more schooling also makes you smarter. A popular line to take in the UK by those interested in how inequality unrolls through the life course is that it starts early, and therefore early intervention is the key to equalising life chances. Measuring the cognitive ability of very young children is hard, but one thing that can be measured is language development. Kids from better off homes on average score higher on tests of this than kids from worse off homes. So when children enter school, those from the worst off groups are already at a disadvantage. The question then arises as to whether participation in early preschool education can eradicate that gap. The answer that Becker's study gives is, and rather emphatically, no. However, her evidence is consistent with the story that without such early interventions, the gap would be wider than it actually is. The life course starts somewhere, and there is usually a presumption that social origins have a long arm which affects and modifies the effects of many of the mechanisms that lie along the pathway to particular social destinations. But this raises the question of what actually a social origin is, and whether it makes sense to try and disaggregate it into component parts. It turns out that the answer depends on being more precise about the question you're asking. If the issue is purely one of prediction, how much variation in adult SES or income is predicted by variation in social origin, then one wants a rather rich characterization of social origins. In a sense, the more the merrier, as long as this is strictly policed by out-of-sample validation. The end point of this approach is the estimation of social origin effects by examining sibling correlations. Siblings, as long as they're not too far apart in age and of the opposite sex, share many of the features of their social origins, as well as half their genes. The larger the correlation, the larger the effect of social origins. Of course, this is a bit of an everything but the kitchen sink approach, which does not allow you to apportion so much to father's class, so much to father's education, so much to mother's education, and so forth. Another approach is represented by one of the papers in your packet. This tries to estimate the effects of a limited but richer than normal set of variables characterizing the social origins of a set of survey respondents. They then estimate some numbers and ask whether these have changed over time. My personal take on this is that it is unlikely to be a terribly helpful way of proceeding. The problem is to understand what the numbers so estimated actually mean. Clearly, they are not interpretable as causal effects. They are most simply interpretable as weights in a prediction equation. But if we interpret them in that way, our primary concern should not be with the value the weights themselves take, but with the quality of the prediction. A take-home from this, of wider applicability than just this seminar, is before running a regression, you should really get clear in your mind why you are doing it. Is your intellectual project to do with estimating causal effects, or is it a prediction problem? I have a sneaky feeling that less of the rainforest would be sacrificed if social scientists thought more along these lines.